One of the things we do is we have been tracking the number of Islamist-related terrorist plots since 9/11. And so obviously only using unclassified data. The first time we did this, I was actually a little nervous. After we got our list, and it was like 19, which is a couple of years ago, it seemed like a lot to me. So I actually called up the guy at the FBI. I said, hey, we have a list. Can we look, compare it to your list? And he said, you have a list? So could you fax me your list? I don't know if I was talking to the wrong guy or whatever, but so if you look at this 60, it's really interesting. Of course, we've had some successful ones like Boston. That's very few. I think the number is like 3 or 4. We have 3 that were foiled, simply by luck: the underwear bomber, the shoe bomber, and the Times Square bomber.
Not by luck. Not by luck. There was an element of luck, but they were not foiled by luck. They were not foiled by luck.
Okay, so we had 3 that were pure luck.
No, not by luck. Not by luck.
Okay,
yeah.
So we had 3 that were pure luck, but
I don't know which ones those 3 are.
Well, don't get me wrong, catching the Times Square bomber, that was awesome. That was a great example of awesome interagency cooperation. Stopping him was luck. The guy was just a crappy bomb maker.
Can I say something, Chris? Can I get in on this point? I think it's
absolutely.
Important. I think it's important.
Provided you disagree.
Did you think he's a good bomb maker?
Yeah. Luck, not luck. Luck, not luck. No. Here's what I want to say. It's interesting, the choice of words here. I think, in a sense, the Times Square bomber, insofar as the plot was foiled in part by the heads-up baseball of a New Yorker.
Explain the Times Square bomber.
Okay, so we had a situation in the summer of 2010, thank you, Matt, where an individual called Faisal Shahzad, living in Connecticut, say about 40 miles north of New York City, having been radicalized by the Pakistani branch of the Taliban, decides to detonate a homemade bomb in Times Square, New York City, on a summer evening. And look, he has the bomb, he's there, he detonates the thing, it doesn't go off exactly right. And at that point, a bunch of New Yorkers actually get in on the action, and a local vendor, a kind of street merchant, essentially becomes one of the kind of the key players in taking a situation that could have been terrible and managing it and bringing it to a very successful resolution. The point I want to underscore here is that's not luck. That's the American public that's been sensitized to this issue, that's been engaged, that's actually doing its job. So the idea that if it's not being done by someone who wears a uniform, then it's luck, I think is the wrong message to be sending at this point. Boston, a lot of heads-up baseball by the citizens of Boston in figuring out who these guys were. There's a fancy term, I kind of like this term because as an academic I trade in fancy terms. There's a fancy term out there called surveillance. And the idea behind surveillance is this. Surveillance is the French for watching from above, but surveillance is the French for watching from below. And it captures this idea that the citizenry can be involved in a very deep way in managing terrorist threats. And I think I would just say, as part of my kind of editorial on this kind of luck, unluck kind of repartee, that's not luck to me.
All
that's
right,
engagement.
I'm sorry. People think it's a great idea that the way to stop terrorism.
And they're still not applauding because I'm from the Bronx.
If you think it's a great idea, the way to stop terrorism is not, I'm not saying anything about anybody's courage, but the notion of people tackling somebody on a plane, and that's how we want to stop terrorism, that I don't know.
Works for me.
Well, I'm glad it works for you, because it certainly doesn't work for me. But what I did want to say is, if you look at the 50-plus plots that were actually thwarted, from what we can tell from the court records and everything else we have access to, overwhelmingly they thought it because people did their job. The law enforcement did their job right in terms of, and in some cases there were individuals who saw something and said something, and that led to an investigation. But they did their job right a lot of times, and I don't think it's disputable that the United States is a harder target for transnational terrorism than it was on 9/11. I think that's a fact. So the question really is and Sam said it so beautifully, which is why I don't want him to talk anymore. But it really is, it's really not a question about even constitutional judgments often are political. It really is a question about what kind of country that we want to live in. And I actually think that at the end of the day, the American people will make the right judgment, and they will be able to figure out, if you ask them, gave them a common sense problem of how I want security and freedom, they would say, well, we think this is sensible and reasonable. The problem sometimes is we have a political leadership that is really, because we are so successful at dealing with transnational terrorism, that they feel free to play politics with that. And I think the Snowden revelations is a good idea. So to see members of the Senate and Congress come up and with shock and dismay that these programs exist, when they voted for the laws that put them into existence, and you can actually kind of go read Section 215 and Section 702, and maybe you don't know it's called PRISM, and maybe you don't know exactly, but the authority of what you actually have to do and the obligations you have, I mean, it's kind of in the law.
Yeah.
And this kind of, Inspector Rousseau, I can't believe there's, gambling going on in this establishment. What are the American people supposed to think? I mean, we're going to Walmart. We're not sitting there every day reading Section 215. We would have hoped that a politician would have done that. And when they spoke about that, when the Fox News put the camera in front of their face, they would have been a little more, candid or honest about it.
In fact, let's segue a little to this whole issue of the authorities.
Can I just say one
Yeah.
thing? And I do want to talk about that too, but I want to just, I think it's a point of commonality here. And one on Faisal Shahzad and Times Square. It wasn't just Citizen, but also the fire department of New York recognized something they hadn't seen before, but they had actually been trained because of really programs like the Cell and others that train local firefighters and police to recognize signs of bombs and terrorist attacks in the making. But I think more, and Jim, to your point, I do think when people talk about this, they talk about resilience a lot. And people will say that, well, the U.S. is not as resilient as other countries. And I do think there's a distinction to be made between the resilience of the American people, and we saw that on display in Boston, that very vivid image of police leaving Watertown after capturing the younger guy, Johar. A distinction between that and our political class, and which really doesn't really tend to show the same degree of resilience in response to these kinds of things. And I think that is a distinction that's worth making.
Yeah. If we could talk a little about the issue of these authorities for, this is the key question, the line between, what kind of country, as Jim said, what kind of country do you want to live in? And so I wonder if you could talk about, as much as you can, about what are these programs and what are the authorities that allow these programs? Because this goes to really the heart of this whole issue with Snowden. It goes to really the question of, as Jim said, what kind of country do we live in?
Sure. And I'll be sort of brief in talking about the two programs that were recently disclosed. And now these are both programs run by the National Security Agency. And I think, Jim, you're right. I mean, there's a little bit of the sense that a lot of this was already out there, particularly on one of the two programs, but I'll walk through them both quickly. The first program is sometimes referred to as Section 215. It's a provision of the Patriot Act that authorizes the government to get business records. In this case, and what's now been disclosed, is that the government collected business records in the form of call data information. The most important point of all of this is that none of that included the content of any phone call. It included the numbers called and the duration of the call. And those are business records that the phone companies keep. But importantly,
Those are what you get on your bill.
They keep it for billing purposes.
Yeah.
They're business records. They need them for their own business purposes. But importantly, they don't necessarily keep them for very long. They keep them for as long as it's useful for them to have them. And there are multiple phone companies that keep these records. So the basic concept behind Section 215 and that program was that the NSA used that provision, which allowed the government to go to the FISA court. The FISA court is a court that sits in classified session in Washington, D.C.
What does that stand for?
The Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. And it's a court created in 1978 to handle exactly these kinds of situations. And the court approved the government's request to compel these companies to provide these records. What's really important about this, as well as the fact that this is not content, is that once this information was collected, it could only be accessed. So an analyst at NSA, and only a handful of analysts had this authority, but analysts at NSA would have to demonstrate that the basis on which they would look into this data was a phone number that itself was reasonably tied to a terrorism investigation. So this is not a case of trolling through the data or data mining. It is a case of doing link analysis of phone numbers based on a phone number that the NSA would demonstrate had a connection, reasonably had a connection to terrorism.
So of this list of calls that an individual has made, they found out that one of these numbers or more was made to a number belonging to a known terrorist.
Well, so I give you a very concrete example that's been recently discussed here, and it hits close to home, and that's Najibullah Zazi. So some of you may remember Najibullah Zazi was a resident of Aurora, and in 2009, September of 2009, he was identified, and he was identified in the other program. But one of the things that happened was once he was identified as having a connection to terrorists overseas, the NSA took a phone number that was connected to Zazi, who's now connected to an al-Qaeda operative overseas, and ran that number against this database. And one of the numbers that they found when they did that was a phone number of somebody that the FBI had awareness of, but who turned out to be closer connected to Zazi than the FBI knew, and in fact corroborated the FBI's investigation. So it was a phone number relating to a co-conspirator who is now being prosecuted. So that's a very concrete example of the way that it's basically looking into the database based on a seed number to find links to that particular number, not the content.
All right, so this is Section 215. So that's one authority.
So that's one.
215.
215. 215, or business provision. So the other program is quite different. It does apply to the content of internet communications. And this was a change to the law that was adopted by Congress, as you point out, Jim, after multiple briefings and lots of public debate in 2008, which authorized the government to go to the FISA court and get the FISA court to approve procedures that would allow the government to target non-U.S. persons overseas with electronic surveillance, essentially, to collect the content of their communications. What the law specifically prohibits is the collection of any communications of U.S. persons, targeting any U.S. persons anywhere in the world, inside the United States, outside the United States. So basically said that it was okay for, under these particular procedures approved by the FISA court, for the government to collect targeting non-U.S. persons overseas. And that's, in fact, going back to the Zazi example, how Zazi was first identified. Through the targeting of a known al-Qaeda operative in Pakistan, I believe, who was in contact with this guy in Aurora, Colorado.
Okay, so that's a second authority. And Sam, so far so good? I mean, is that all something a government should be doing?
Okay, let's talk about both of those programs. And I think so far so good in terms of does the audience here in Denver now know more than 99.99% of the United States? And thank goodness, by the way, this is exceedingly valuable because debates about these issues are frequently demagogued, and you would get the impression reading certain accounts that the NSA had morphed into the Gestapo, and you might think from another perspective that there were no civil liberties issues here whatsoever, and I think neither one of those is right at all. Here are some of the underlying constitutional bedrock issues that, in a sense, kind of underpin both 215 on the one hand and 702 on the other hand. So let's talk about 215 for a moment. The constitutional law on which this statutory provision rests is an interpretation of the Fourth Amendment by the Supreme Court 40 years ago in a case called Smith, 35 years ago, in which the Supreme Court said that the Fourth Amendment's protections, the privacy protections guaranteed by the Constitution's Fourth Amendment, do not apply to what is frequently called nowadays metadata. Here's the metaphor that lawyers often use to capture what metadata is: the information that's written on the outside of an envelope, as opposed to the information on the letter that's contained inside the envelope. So the Supreme Court said in its Smith precedent that concerning who you called and how long you spoke on the phone, that information is not privileged. It's not protected by the Fourth Amendment. There could be no Section 215 of the Patriot Act if there were not the Smith precedent underpinning it. Let me just say very briefly what the 702 law, the FISA Amendments Act.
I'm going to tell people there will be a test.
All right, if I'm boring you with kind of law professorese, I'll keep this really, really short. Let me just say this. If 215 is about the idea that the Fourth Amendment's privacy guarantees don't apply to what's on the outside of the envelope, meaning it doesn't apply to who you call, how long you spoke, and so forth, then 702 is principally about the idea that when the government is collecting intelligence for the purpose of doing national security, when it's collecting foreign intelligence, it's an open question constitutionally in the Supreme Court, and a lot of the lower courts have actually decided the issue in favor of the government to the effect the Fourth Amendment does not apply. So there are constitutional rulings that underpin both. But here's the point I actually want to convey. I'm not here to tell you that there's a case called Smith in 1978, or there's a case called Keith, which opens up a lot of terrain when it comes to the legality of foreign intelligence gathering. What I'm here to tell you is that the Fourth Amendment in the Bill of Rights explicitly speaks in terms of searches that are reasonable, and that what's reasonable in 1978 may not be reasonable in 2013. It's a moving target, what's reasonable. The framers of our Constitution, in all of their genius, knew this, understood this, and built into the logic of the Fourth Amendment the idea that reasonableness was going to be the touchstone, reasonableness being a kind of open-ended term that necessarily moves over time. And by the way, this isn't a liberal conservative issue. There's probably no greater zealot on behalf of Fourth Amendment privacy in the Supreme Court than Antonin Scalia. So this isn't a question about what the Republicans say versus what the Democrats say. This is ultimately a question about what the meaning of reasonableness is in a society that's governed by big data, where big data is everywhere, where our banks possess it, where our retailers possess it, and where our government possesses it, and what it means to translate this concept of reasonableness into terms that make sense in 2013 in a world where there are real live threats that have to be dealt with.
Jim, explain how.
Well, I mean, that's actually a great point. And in a sense, when Congress passed the FISA update in 2008, it kind of got that. So in the case of 702, even though you could argue that the government really has no Fourth Amendment obligations.
Now, let's remind people, 702
is foreign intelligence, foreign intelligence collection. That person's a foreigner. He's not entitled to any protections under the Constitution. The law actually adds protections beyond which you would some people might argue are even required. So there was a case where Congress says, look, we're going to add some stuff in anyway. And I think that to me is where I always hoped the debate would really rest, and it never quite did. And the Patriot Act for me has always been kind of the penultimate example. And I was kind of right in the middle of that. It was we were in this enormous debate about Patriot Act good or bad. It's this completely Manichaean thing, is black or white. You have to throw it out or not. So I was actually in a debate. I was in a debate with a woman. It was a call-in show in Africa. She was in New York. I was in Washington, D.C. And we were all talking to each other. And I won't tell you where she came from. The initials are ACLU. And this guy in Africa says, well, America, they've passed that Patriot Act, and that Patriot Act, and that just wipes out the Constitution. And this woman said, yes, which was kind of weird. But what the debate should have always been about the Patriot Act is, look, there are terrorists out there trying to kill us. We need to stop them. There's data that we have to look at. Nobody wants to live in a garrison state or a surveillance society. We were born in America. We'd like to live in America. We actually would love to live in a land of liberty. We also don't want to get killed in our beds. So all we ask you, the people that we elect and send to Congress, is to come up with a stupid law that keeps us safe and allows us to live free in our country. That's all we ask. And so, but rather than having kind of a common sense debate about, do we have the oversight right? Do we have the checks and balances right? Do we have all the repealing requirements right? Is the government actually operating these programs the way they're supposed to? Do they really need this authority to go after that? Rather than have this kind of common sense nuts and bolts debate, we would sit there and scream at each other and say, well, if you're for the Patriot Act, you're a fascist, and if you're against it, well, you just want us all to be killed by terrorists. And here we are, in 2013, not everybody, because most Americans are really indifferent. I mean, they can't spell 702 and 215. Most American, but you know, kind of the people who are supposedly the professional discussants on this, the people that beat up on Matt, they're kind of work back to kind of 2001 language, and they're screaming that these programs are obviously evil, or oh my God, they're perfect, and we can't have a sensible discussion about, well, do we have it exactly right?
Yeah. What's your view, though, of the FISA court? This is an absolutely the key institution in this 702 and in other issues. Is it working?
So I was at a conference on the same subject, and it was back actually when we were debating talking about the revisions in the 2008 FISA law, and so I was asked to present at the conference and to kind of explain the FISA court and explain the issues. This was a conference for judges and justices. It was part of that professional, you know, like you have to get your professional development credit things, right? So the judge that was sitting next to me was the chief judge of the FISA court. So I'm like kind of going through this thing the whole time, and I'm looking like, am I okay here? Because, you know, obviously he can't really talk about what he's doing, but I can. So, look, I mean, if I don't see how you get out of something like the FISA court. But to Sam's point, it's about choices that we make. So the question is do we really want the FISA court to evolve into some kind of real national security court where we're treating legal issues in a manner separate and different than we do anything else? Or are we going to kind of keep it what it was, you know, originally designed to be, which is a very narrow thing? We put a lot more on their plate. I think they're doing a reasonable job. One of the criticisms you often get is, well, they don't turn down warrants or whatever. But, you know, look, I mean, I've talked to a lot of people that work at the FISA court. When you go to the court, you have your act together. Yeah. You know, idiots just don't walk up there. So things don't get shot down because people are scared to death to going to a court and getting rejected and looking like an idiot. Yeah. So I think the court's working, but I share, you know, Sam's point is let's not make sure we're drifting into doing something with a legal system that we really never intended to do.
Yeah. Okay.
So we're not doing what you asked, Larry, because we're pretty much agreeing here on a lot of this.
Yeah,
but I actually spent a fair number of times appearing before the FISA court and arguing these matters.
What's that like? How many?
Well, so the FISA court is made up of 11 judges. They serve 7-year terms.
So they're sitting up in a panel?
Yeah, there are these torches, and then they have. No.
Look, they're regular federal judges. They have life tenure. They're Article III judges, and they serve on this court that's a specialized court in Washington, D.C. that was really set up in response to the abuses of the 70s, and it imposes a real independent check on executive branch authority, just as it was designed to do. I'm not aware of other countries that have a FISA court. So it's odd, or anything like it, when warrants are, when the government wants to seek a warrant for surveillance, for national security surveillance, in most countries it's an administrative or ministerial act. Here we have an independent judiciary that reviews warrants to conduct surveillance of American citizens. And it is not a rubber stamp. The numbers are quite high in terms of the government's success rate. But a couple things on that. One, the numbers are about the same as they are for criminal wiretaps. So when the government seeks a criminal wiretap, they have about the same degree of success rate as they do to get a national security wiretap. And two, there's a lot of back and forth between the court and the government. So the court will identify weaknesses or identify factual errors or factual areas where more facts are needed to reach the probable cause standard, and there'll be a back and forth with the court before the application is ultimately presented and then in most cases approved. So it's a very robust practice, and not at all the impression that has been created of it being simply a rubber stamp.
Yeah. Yeah.
I do think that the harder thing, I think, just to get to the more, I think, philosophical point, more interesting in some ways, is how do we achieve greater degree of transparency in how we do these things? Because for me and my work, we need to be sufficiently transparent to earn the trust of the American people. But we also have to be pretty careful about how transparent we can be about classified collection programs, because we know that Al-Qaeda is watching and adjusting their tactics to what they're reading in the newspaper. So this is a very, very difficult problem to be transparent enough. And we've worked with the intelligence committees in Congress, the rest of Congress. We work with the court, obviously. But, we need to find that right balance where we're sufficiently transparent, but not so revealing that we ultimately undermine our capabilities.
And two small issues just on that point. One would be this. Look, we're obviously not going to invite C-SPAN into the FISA court. That's a non-starter. But
No C-SPAN in the FISA court?
Well, no one watches. Does Al-Qaeda watch C-SPAN? I don't know.
Yeah.
Maybe they
Yes,
do.
they do.
Yeah, they're the only guys who watch C-SPAN. Shoot, now I'm really in trouble.
Oh, man.
Yeah.
We're going to be getting
For the
C-SPAN.
record, I used to listen to C-SPAN radio. That's how geeked out I was at this point in my life, okay? So one thing we might do is to take a step in the direction that British and Israeli courts have done, which is to designate special advocates. In other words, to give security clearances to some trusted defense lawyer types and to allow them to advocate for the other side to the FISA court, to create an adversarial environment where it's not just the government and the court in an iterative process, it's the government, it's the court, and it's the other side, albeit it's the other side with the right kinds of clearances and the right level of trustworthiness. So that's one issue. Another issue that Matt is, I think, gesturing at, and I think that's really important and it's been reported on in the press in the last couple of weeks, is to what degree ought the opinions of the FISA court remain secret? So we've learned reading the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal over the last week or so that there's actually a body of Fourth Amendment jurisprudence that's being made by this specialized tribunal in secret. Now, I appreciate that there has to be some level of secrecy that attaches to these kinds of programs. We can't give away the game in the course of explicating the Fourth Amendment. On the other hand, it does strike me as passing strange that there is essentially a parallel universe of law and legal decisions that are being made by a tribunal without the ability of the general law-reading audience to scrutinize those opinions and to weigh in.
But just on that, so I think folks in here who may have even followed this quite closely, I suspect, would not be aware that in 2008, the FISA Court of Review, so there's a FISA court and then there's a court of review that sits over it, made up of appellate judges, issued an opinion that the legal reasoning has been declassified, validating, upholding the predecessor to the FISA Amendments Act, a law in 2007, but essentially the exact same program that was released to leaked with all this fanfare under the name PRISM. But that law was upheld by a court in a declassified opinion in 2008. And even I suspect folks who followed this issue closely, you would be hard pressed to find that reporting on that fact.
So they've kind of both illustrated kind of the crux to the challenge. So what I've, for example, talked to intelligence folks, I said, don't tell me anything classified, but suggest to me, what do you think the national security damage that Snowden has actually done? How has he really hurt us? What they said is what they think the most damaging thing is not revealing the existence of the program, because theoretically the terrorists could have read the law as well, but that revealing, in a sense, the checks and balances and the limitations that we place on the program, and so in a sense, helping giving them guidance kind of on how to circumvent that kind of surveillance in the future. So that.
I wonder if in talking about the need for more transparency, one would think that the whole Snowden case would shed more light on these issues, and yet it seems to be the opposite.
I do tell a story very quickly. So I get called this lunch. Do you want to have lunch with the French Interior Minister? And so the Interior Minister in France essentially, in many ways, has some of the authorities and powers that our Homeland Security Secretary has. So they're very involved in national security affairs. And he was in the United States to meet with some government officials and actually talk a lot about the terrorist pipeline, which they're very worried about, and some other issues. But he was very keen to have kind of an on-the-record lunch to talk to some people, so he knew that the French are really out there battling terrorism. So it was just basically me and two other reporters, and they were asking all the questions because they're reporters. And the one of them just looked at the face and said, "Well, what about this PRISM thing?" And the minister, I said in there, I would have never expected. He said, "I am very jealous of Americans." He goes, on the one hand, I'm very jealous that you have a very good program, which is better than ours, for doing overseas intelligence against terrorists. I'm very jealous. And he goes, I'm also jealous that you have much better and more thoughtful oversight from your judicial system and your parliamentary system than we have. And I thought, wow, that's a remarkable statement. The only caveat to that is the next day he went out and said that somebody asked him in a press conference the same thing, and he goes, "Oh, those terrible Americans are spying on us."
You know, I hate to do this because it's so wonkish, but I do, Matt, if you could explain PRISM, I mean, what this computer
Well, PRISM,
is.
I think, has been pretty much reported at this point is simply the name for the computer system at NSA that facilitated the 702 program. So it's just an internal name because what was leaked were NSA documents, but it really just describes the information that's collected under this 702 program. Again, the program that targeted non-U.S. citizens outside the United States, the internet communications of
And
those
this is
individuals.
what you would call in the commercial sector data mining.
Wait, no, it's more targeted than that. It is the collection of the internet communications targeting non-U.S. citizens overseas. So it's an email sent from a person in Pakistan to a person in Afghanistan. No Fourth Amendment rights to any of those individuals. NSA goes and does that under rules that the FISA court approves that are designed to reasonably assure that the targets are actually who NSA says they are, non-U.S. citizens overseas. To be clear, though, it becomes more controversial when that same communication is not foreign to foreign, but foreign to U.S., so that the target is overseas, but the communication on the other end that's incidentally collected is the communication with one end inside the United States. And for that, NSA has procedures designed to minimize how that information is both used and disseminated.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So I should just say, my own reaction to this, and that was pretty wonkish, I get, but stepping back a bit, that these rules are followed with an incredible degree of fidelity by the professionals that implement these programs, subject to executive branch oversight, judicial oversight, congressional oversight, and I agree with the French official that you talked to. I've never seen, and I've traveled quite a bit and talked to folks about this, anything that really compares to the system of oversight of these types of programs that we have in our country.
So with regard to this Snowden case where he has made revelations or apparent revelations of our what we do abroad in the 702 program, how are relations with abroad? I mean, Jim is suggesting the French are fine in private, but not so fine in public. But I suspect that's not the first time that issues ever come up with the French. I mean, how are we doing with other services? Are we able to move forward on this?
Well, I think it remains to be seen sort of what the overall reaction is going to be. I mean, there's been some of the disclosures have had nothing to do with these two programs. Some of the disclosures had to do with the U.S. What's been reported as U.S. surveillance in China, and so all this kind of disclosure can't be helpful to both our intelligence efforts as well as our diplomatic efforts.
Yeah.
I mean, as an ambassador, imagine yourself sitting in that situation, having to explain to your counterpart, how that might go.
It's very awkward.
Yeah.
And Sam, I mean, from the point of view of being in charge of intelligence for the NYPD, from being at NYU, I mean, you've seen these kind of data clouds from both sides, and from the point of view of the personal liberties and from the issue of protection of our society. And how do you see us doing in that? Have we kept that balance? I mean, Matt presents a pretty inspiring picture of oversight and control, which I think is something a citizen wants to see. How do you see that?
Yeah, my sense is that the system, as Matt described it, is working on its own terms. But what I would say is that begs the larger question that I'm trying to kind of get at, which is, what should the terms of these kinds of programs be? Now, I said to you earlier that the Supreme Court 30 years ago decided that envelope information would be outside the purview of the Fourth Amendment. But there really ought to be a footnote to that, which is in a case this year and a case last term, the Supreme Court has has gestured in the direction of revisiting that assumption in a world in which data is as prevalent as it is in our world. And so it's conceivable that the foundations of these kinds of programs, which are working on their own terms, may be fundamentally changed as the court and as society revisit some very basic assumptions about how we interact with big data.
Yeah, I would raise a different red flag. One of the other studies we did is, there was a lot of discussion about cybersecurity legislation and whether the federal government should have a large regulatory role or not. And then some of the bills said, well, yes, the federal government should have a very large regulatory role and really tell the private sector how to maintain and secure data. So one of the things I asked my guys to do is to go back and do a search at federal data breaches. It's an 18-page paper. Every single federal agency, maybe not every single one, but I mean, the federal government's record with maintaining data is actually pretty bad. And so I've never actually heard anybody say, we've got all these systems and they always work perfectly, and nobody ever, violates it or steals stuff like Snowden, right? So what I really worry about is for all the good intention, all the purpose and everything else is, a lot of times our government just isn't very good at maintaining these large databases. And so, look, I mean, my stuff gets stolen by the Chinese every day. The question is are we combating terrorists, or are we just collecting all the information so the Chinese have one convenient place to go get it?
Matt, I'm going to give you the last word on this.
I appreciate that. I think this a terrific event, and I know everyone feels that way up here. I mean, and doing everything they could do to protect the country. The challenge is, as this debate or this discussion sort of shows, is it's hard sometimes to find where that line is. The line changes, it zigzags, and we need to continue to have this debate to decide exactly where that line should be.
Okay, one more question. Sam, would you tell, if you were Snowden's lawyer, would you tell him to come home and face the charges? Take your time, we have all night.
God gave us 2 ears and 1 mouth.
Okay. All right, I'll let you go on that. But let me just say, this has been an absolute pleasure, not only to see you on this panel, but to see what all three of you have done for our country, to keep us safe, to manage the balance of the freedoms that this country is so proud of. So thank you so much for your service. And